Hi, I'm Melissa Fisher, and welcome to Profit Through Property podcast. And I'm here today with James Dawson. Now, James, I met you quite some years ago, and I believe it was when I actually did your course, which set me up for an amazing future in commercial property. Now, I actually spent a little bit of time with you, and we have discussed in depth some of the projects you do and how they've actually set you up for the lifestyle that was ultimately what you were doing this for. And I know you've written books and you've done some fantastic courses and passed on a huge amount of information to many, many people that have actually been life-changing and set people on a totally different trajectory with your knowledge and how you actually managed to get into and hold on to commercial property for passive income. Now, it's not as everyone seems, and this is where what I got out of your course way back then changed my life. It changed the way I actually considered using commercial property for passive income, which is what we're going to touch on today. So talk to me, James. What I'd love to know from you, first up, is how you got into it, how you actually started thinking about commercial property the way you do, because it's not how the general population actually sees it.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm probably pretty much like every property investor that ever started, when you sort of come out of school and think, okay, I want to be a property investor, or, you're in your 20s or 30s and you suddenly think, gee, I better get some investments, because I want to provide for myself later on, or just, be wealthier. So started in residential like most people do, and, buying houses. I mean, it started pretty young. I started about 18. So I was buying and renovating houses, and my first house I bought in Newcastle, I think, was $17,000. I mean, less than the stamp duty now, so, but, at the time, interest rates were 14, 18%. And, it was a lot of negativity around then as well, which, people said, oh, it must have been easy in those days. Well, I reckon it's actually easier now. But anyway, I was buying and renovating properties, working as a real estate agent, property manager, and in sales for a company, and doing the renovations at night on the weekend. But what I was finding was that I was sort of chasing my tail. I really couldn't get the cash flow goals. I felt like I had to sell something all the time to actually get the cash, out of the deals. And then basically stumbled across commercial property and how it was all sort of cash flow based. It was essentially, my old boss said to me one day in the real estate agency, he said, oh, I only buy stuff that's cash flow positive. And I'd never actually heard that before. And because everything was negative geared, everything was, kicking the can for a couple of $100 a week to support that property. And then you get another property and you'd get the rents up, and, somehow it would all balance out. But just the first little property I bought in Carrington in Newcastle was suddenly, 3,000 or 4,000 a year cash flow positive just in the first year, and then it went even better the next year. And I thought, wow, what am I doing? I'm just going to focus on this. So that's how it all started.
Isn't that interesting? So a couple of things I want to touch on there, because a lot of people will look at property investing and they instantly go to residential because they know what a home is. Everyone's lived in one, aims to own their own homes and these sort of things. And once people get into their own home, there's that natural, oh, I'll go and buy another residential property, without even understanding how they're going to make passive income. Like there's the whole negative gearing and everything that goes with it. But there really isn't a lot of thought behind what to do to end up with cash in the bank. And it becomes that buy and sell way of being, which is not ideally, I mean, it's great for a chunk of money, but it's not ideally creating a lifestyle that you can kick back and enjoy with money hitting the bank. So interesting where you started and the age you started at. And I've got to agree with you. It's easy to look back and say, oh, wow, you only paid $17,000 for that way back there. But you've got to understand the date that was and the value of money back then to what it is now. I mean, it's very, very relative. So to be able to make $3,000 a year off it back then, if we want to do the comparisons, that's massive. That's a massive change from trying to play around with residential property, because it's what we know, to all of a sudden getting into things a little bit differently. So for you, and again, I've had the luxury of spending time with you, But for you, what I really got out of it was, for you, this was lifestyle. This was about getting to a point where you can go and do what you want to do and enjoy the lifestyle you want whilst doing property investing, and money's hitting your bank month on month and allowing you to go surfing or trip over to Europe or whatever it is that you want to do. So has that been successful for you?
Oh, look, I think absolutely. I mean, I actually, when I was working that real estate agency when I was really young, I thought, I'm looking at the senior partner there, and I thought, wow, it's 40 years older than me, and I thought, I can't be there in 40 years' time. I just can't be doing that. So then my goal sort of changed. I thought, well, it's all about replacing my income. And I can't really remember what my income was at that time, from the real estate office. It was probably pretty good income. It might have been $30,000, $40,000 a year at the time. And I just thought, wow, if I can develop that amount of money over and above all my payments and all my costs, okay, I'm free and clear. I can leave this, 9 to 5 job and go and do my own thing. Now, of course, doing that, also has problems. When someone gets out of a job, you think, oh, all my friends are working. What am I doing? So, but I was just more deals. So, yeah, essentially that was the driving force for me. It was really like, okay, I want to replace my income and then, look at what other things I can do. And, that had its challenges, with, banks and things like that. When I was trying to buy other properties, they're saying, oh, what do you actually do? And I said, well, I'm just doing this. This is what I'm doing. And, I had
not what they want to hear, is it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I remember one bank manager saying, wow, well, it looks pretty good to me, so they were supportive, but some bank managers weren't, so there was a few challenges there. But I think anyone that's in real estate investment always are going to have, you're always going to have financing challenges. So you've just got to push through that and keep your ultimate goal in view, basically, so you get there.
Oh, absolutely. So when you first got into commercial property, because I know there's a lot of questions about getting into commercial property and it sounds easy and all of these things. When you first got into commercial property, what was the biggest challenge that you actually hit, the first biggest one that you had to actually get over to go, oh yeah, this works?
Well, the first biggest challenge was actually that first property, because I was buying it vacant, and when and it was sort of and it was completely out of my comfort zone, because naturally if you go and buy a little house or a little apartment, you just give it to the real estate agent and they lease it. So the first thing was to find out what rental I could get for that property. And I rang a valuer and then asked my old boss, and he said, oh, that's easy. Just go down the street, find out what the other shops are rented for. And then he helped me with that. And he said, this shop will get that. He said, put an ad in the Newcastle Morning Herald. There was no internet then. And within a month, and I actually cleaned the place out. I think I hosed it out. It was an old butcher shop, hosed it out, got rid of the old cool room, cleaned the windows, put the for lease sign on the window, and then, sort of sat back thinking, God, I hope this works, And within a month or so, I had a tenant in there who was manufacturing little fretwood stuff for Federation houses. So he sort of, pivoted on that shop. It wasn't a butcher shop anymore. And that was the biggest challenge. And then I thought, wow, okay, my payments are X, the rent's this. And then the valuer said to me months later, I think I was able to pull out about $90,000 out of that deal. And I said, how come it's worth so much? He said, it's simple. It's based on the rent, James. That was the biggest thing I ever learned. The first thing. He said, the value of this is based on the rental income. Simple as that.
So I want to stop there for a minute, because it is a key point when you're looking at commercial property versus residential property. And it's something that I think a lot of people don't understand. It is a different transition from working with residential property and understanding that. And there's an amount to understand to go over to commercial and understand where your income comes from and then what your value actually is based on. So for you to experience that property one way back then had to totally change the way you saw commercial property in its entirety.
Oh, absolutely. Because, with your residential investing, and I love all property, but, I'd buy a little house, fix it all up, and then you get a tenant in. Then every 6 months, that was the other thing. Every 6 months, the tenants be going out. There'd be repairs, and there was all emotion around that property. I would buy it almost a little bit based on emotion, because you think, oh, I love this little cottage. I'm going to fix it up, get some nice tenants, And, you know, it was all that sort of lovey-dovey stuff. But whereas commercial was like, buy this, get this income, values based on that income, move on, do something else. And the tenant signs a 5-year lease or a 3-year lease, something like that. And you think, wow, okay, no more in and outs every 6 months, no more little repairs because it's in the lease that the tenant repairs stuff in a commercial. So that just, it was like this sort of learning graph that just went like this in the first 2 years of me buying those commercials.
I'm going to say that was, and it's quite interesting because listening to you talk through that would almost have to be the biggest challenge going in, because that the unknown and the oh my Lord, is this going to work? Am I going to get a tenant? What does it actually look like? So the challenge going in, but also one of the biggest successes too. So learning that valuable piece of information about the value on property based on the lease would have to have been a total game changer. So from there, how did you scale it though? Because it's nice to say, that's great. We've turned a butcher shop, which again, I say is a big snippet of information that people need to listen to. I've turned a butcher shop into something totally different, because if we think we have to replace it with the same, we're very limited on what we're going to look at from a tenancy perspective. So there was quite a few steps that you made and different ways of thinking and executing into that first property that set you up for success moving forward that many people won't consider.
Well, the other thing, the other thing that sort of happened too was that I realized that, you know, when you've got a situation where it's based on the numbers pretty much, you know, you could much more easily go to the bank and sort of say, look, if I buy this next property, you know, one of the next ones I bought was in Potts Point in Sydney. And I remember going to the bank and I said, look, you know, I can lease the ground floor for $40,000 a year and it's got a couple of apartments above. Maybe I could turn those into offices. And suddenly the bank guy sort of said, well, let's just look at the numbers on the paper, you know. And I remember buying this building in Potts Point for $310,000. And he said, well, that works based on the numbers, that works. And he hadn't even really looked at the building. Whereas if I was buying a terrace house down there, he would be saying, oh, you know, okay, you're buying a terrace house. Okay, great. You know, get a valuation, do this, do that. I mean, of course I had to get the other one, the Potts Point one valued, but it was just that whole idea that it was based on the numbers and you could move forward pretty much before you bought a deal and work out whether it was going to work or not very quickly.
So isn't that interesting how the banks look at it quite differently? Something I want to touch on here. So again, relationships. So your bank manager is starting to see things a little bit differently. But for them to actually look at it from that perspective and say, oh, okay, that works. We're happy to consider this. So as a lead in from a lending perspective. Yet their LVRs, so your LVR on a commercial loan is generally lower than what it is on a residential property.
That's right. And look, I guess like actually, I reckon probably 90% of people that move into commercial already have some residential. So I was, you know, leveraging some of my residential to get into commercial, and because they were generally lending only around 70%. So in fact, you sort of generally needed about, you know, 35% deposit because by the time you're allowed for your stamp duty and legal costs as well. So, you know, you would basically scrape that together however you could, because the goal was, you know, the carrot at the end was so good, because you think, wow, if I buy this building in Potts Point, you know, this is double the return of what my current the current properties that I was looking at in residential would provide. So I thought, I've got to get this property because this is putting me closer to my goal of getting this passive cash flow. And, you know, I guess I was about 30 then or something by that stage. And I was just sort of focused on that. I thought, well, I've got to buy this building because that's going to put another 10 or 15,000 towards my positive cash flow. And so I was leveraging my other properties to get that 35% deposit.
So understanding what was important to you as a driving force, so that actually kept you going and not get hung up on, I don't have a 35% deposit to put into this. That this is what I want to achieve and I need this. I actually need this building to add to my passive income now, has to have been a driving force for you to keep moving forward. How many people don't step into commercial property because they go, well, I don't have a 35% deposit and don't give.
Right.
what else they can actually do.
And, you know, the thing is too, when you've got your leases in place, the lease is, you know, such a powerful document that, you know, you can go back to the banks and you know, what a lot of people were doing in those days, let's say back in the 80s and 90s, we were banking with so many different banks. You know, you'd be with Westpac, and then someone from Commonwealth would, you know, you'd talk to someone and they'd say, oh, bring all your properties over here. So we're constantly moving around, and probably a lot of people are still doing it now, but all I would have to do was say, here's my commercial leases for my properties that I've got. And they'd say, oh, okay, you've got a 3-year lease and a 5-year lease. And they'd look at that, and such a powerful document. They would, you know, base their loan approvals on those documents.
So give consideration. I've got a interesting thought around this. The various different asset classes within commercial property. Now, I know some people will lean more towards one than another. Do you invest in multiple asset classes? What are your preferences and why?
Well, I think it's, you know, I think a lot of people ask me that question, you know, all the time. Oh, what should I get? An industrial, retail, office, you know, or a hotel, something like that. And I think, you know, you sort of get a bit of an affinity for something. I mean, you know, I love it all, but my current investments are, you know, small regional shopping centres and a couple of little city, you know, properties that have got cafes and stuff like that in them. So, I haven't been, you know, hugely invested in offices. I've always preferred properties that, you know, were sort of perhaps a little bit run down, stuff that I could improve. So that's where I've sort of ended up. But I do love industrial. I haven't got any industrial at the moment, but I see a lot of industrial that's sort of swapping over into that sort of retail mix and office mix as well, rather than just being full of panel beaters, you know. So I love it all, but I think it really depends. Once people go out and start looking at deals, they'll generally find what they have an affinity for. And then, of course, the particular deal itself will, you know, make that decision for them generally.
I've got to agree with that. And I think if people do, they tend to, yeah, you're right, get an affinity for a particular asset class. And it doesn't mean that's the only thing they ever look at. And I'm sure driving around, you are enticed by many things that you actually see. But you tend to lean into a particular asset class or industry base. Interesting you talk about industrial. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love industrial. We definitely see the change in industrial space now. That's not the heavy industrial that it used to be. It's not the dirty industrial that it used to be. And I think some of this is based on a shortage within areas of specific zones. So they allow some lighter use in areas that are closer to residential or closer to a CBD to enable business growth to actually happen. That comes down to knowing your area a little bit too and having those conversations around what's possible, and definitely not being stuck in that it was a panel beater, it'll always be a panel beater, giving consideration to, well, if a panel beater is no longer there or it didn't work, what else can we actually use this for? And I think that goes for everything. There's been a lot said for office space, especially off the back of the last few years. And is it needed the same as what it was? It is valuable the same as what it was. I think if you look at multiple uses for it, you can leverage it very, very differently. I'm seeing some people make some great money off office space at the moment, but they're definitely doing things differently to how we used to actually utilize office space years back. Yeah. What are some of the changes you've noticed in asset classes in the industry since you've been doing it? Because you've been in this game for a little while now.
Oh, look, I think, let's, just touching on the industrial, and I think Byron Industrial Estate's a fantastic example of the sort of pivoting of, people saying, well, look, I've had a shop in town, for example, in Byron, and now half my business is online, so I can get an industrial shed, in a beautifully designed, tilt bill building, with maybe six buildings in there, a cafe at the front, and I can still have my bit of retail, but I've got my office and I'm only paying, say 60% of the rent that I'm paying for in town in Byron. So I've seen a hell of a lot of that happen. And, if you went to the Byron Bay Industrial Estate today, you'd just be blown away by the things that you can eat. You can go to gymnasiums, you can have an ice bath, you can do everything. You can get your car fixed, so and
I
there's
love that.
yeah, and there's the share offices. That's been another big thing, particularly since the shutdowns. They've come back to life big time because I think, I like working from home, but I've got people around me here at home. So but some people hate it, because they're at home on their own, and they're sort of sitting around in their pajamas all day, and they're not talking to anyone. So that sort of thing's really cranking up again now.
The culture shift off the back of lockdowns and not being able to travel and things has been interesting to actually see how it's unfolded. But definitely noticing a big push through all areas of business of people at least going into the office for a part of a week. I think a lot said for that too, that interaction with people. It's okay if you've got people around you at home, but and that is productive,
Yeah,
which
right.
is not everyone can do that, and not everyone enjoys doing that either. So seeing that good mix is perfectly ideal, and definitely noticing it in the rental space for offices too, and how they're being used differently. So shopping centers, which I love, right? And it's always been interesting seeing what you do with them. So can you just give us a short explanation on what a shopping center looks like from a regional perspective, and the sort of returns that you can generate off them? What you would suggest as far as if we're going to look at something, what are the uplifts? What are some of the biggest uplifts from that perspective? Because I know, speaking to some people, the minute you say shopping centre, they think of Westfield.
Yes. Yeah.
Not always like that, though, is it? We don't have to go in at a Westfield level to get into a shopping centre.
No, absolutely. And I think, the lockdowns absolutely prove that the small, strip shops, like a neighborhood shop, that's even not in a shopping center, do very well with, someone can drive their car, park in front of the newsagent, go into the news, go home. So whereas Westfield, of course, during the lockdown, all that terrible situation where those centres were basically off limits. So centres like I've got, which is sort of, in a suburb like Sandstone Lakes Plaza, in a suburb near Bribie Island, master planned suburb, and it's got the, food, local grocer, the hair salon, childcare, dance studio, a gymnasium, those sort of things. They, of course, at the start of the lockdowns, I thought, oh my God, what's going to happen? But actually, we got more inquiry for a couple of vacancies that we had than ever before, because people said, well, I'm not going to go into a big centre. My business is still going, and, people can just drive up to those centres. So I see a lot of these centres all around. I'm not in the buying mode right at this moment, but I see so many little shopping centres that are a little bit run down. The owners are a little bit lazy, and they just need a bit of a freshen up, and it can really make a difference, particularly if you keep the rents down to a nice level, so people have got sustainable rents, so they can make some money, and you can make some money as well.
I think that's a key factor there, isn't it? Being able to work with tenants.
Yeah.
Because it's got to work on both sides. There's no point in having rent that high going, yay, this is great, my returns are fantastic, and yet it's still vacant. Because not only has it affected your income stream, it's also affected the value of your property too. Sitting there vacant is never ideal. So that balance is really good. What tips would you give people for a tenant mix? Because I know it's something you do exceptionally well. And then that balance of getting the right ones in at the right time.
Yeah, I think that's there's a lot of schools of thought, I guess. I mean, some little regional centres almost become medical centres. They've got the doctor, the pathology, the dentist, that sort of thing. And I know a few people that have bought those, and they perform very, very well. But it would also be nice if they had a little cafe or something like that. So sometimes in those centres, you might have room in the car park. You could put, a container style cafe that's open, just during the weekdays. So that's an addition. But traditionally, a good mix for a centre is always, a sort of supermarket, a takeaway food, hair salon, maybe a news agent, maybe not so much anymore, but a chemist is great. Those sort of things that are sort of everyday needs that people, just drive down the street and say, right, get my prescription, get some stuff for lunch, have a coffee, get my hair done, and if I can drop the kids off at the childcare, that's perfect as well. And then I'll go to the gym, so I think people agents always talk about having your key tenant, and they often say, oh, that's the the supermarket. But I think that's sort of changing a bit too. I've seen small centres that have a really big bakery, cafe, tenancy that might take 2 or 3 shops and be absolutely cranking, and that's sort of the driver for that centre. So it has changed a little bit.
It's a good tip that you make there, James, to give consideration to, because if someone's buying something with an amount of vacancy and they don't have an anchor tenant per se, so that one tenancy that's considered the main tenant, to look for what brings that foot traffic. Because like you've just mentioned, a big bakery, people go there every day, and it brings a lot of people in, which those other businesses can then market to and leverage off. And we look at what's convenient for people. I think you've really got to understand it's not just about what you would want, but it's what people in that particular area find convenient. So if it's an area that's big on fitness and health and all of these things, well, then you might want to incorporate that into your shopping centre and encourage people to come along. An amount said for being able to do that, though, because we want to make sure that tenancies work together.
Oh, absolutely. And that's important when you're doing your mix. You don't want to, put someone in, for example, I mean, we've got a local grocer tenant in the centre of Sandstone Lakes, and they do coffee and food as well within the store. So it doesn't preclude us from having another takeaway, but I'd probably, they've got a seating area outside, for a coffee shop and stuff. And the particular location probably isn't super strong for just a dedicated coffee shop. So I've got to be a bit careful there. And he's a great tenant, and he has a turnover rent that he's paying as well, or will be paying. So, any other tenant, I would have to consider him, and sort of say, well, look, I'm going to put let's say a noodle shop in or something like that. He'd be perfectly happy. But if I want to put a cafe in, he's probably not going to be so happy.
And we want to look after our tenants because longevity is good. The longer that they're there, the more stable they are, the longer they want to stay, the better that is for all of us. The last thing we want is that high turnover of tenancy in commercial property.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a very, very valid point. And I do, like I said, I love the way you give consideration to a lot of things and not necessarily caught up in the old ways or the old thought processes around what needs to be an anchor tenant. But you can't go past looking after good tenancies. You really can't go past that because, again, the stability is what gives you your lifestyle. Okay, if you haven't got high turnover, you get to go and do what you want to do and are very comfortable that your assets looked after, but their rent goes up every year too, doesn't it?
Oh, that's right. I mean, look, at the moment, of course, with people on CPI leases, I sort of feel a little bit sorry for them with the inflation because a lot of the rents in Queensland, I think 7% at the moment, which we can talk about with a little example later on with one of my friends' properties. But most of my tenants, we've got them on 3 or 4% fixed. And then in commercial leases, of course, you've got a market review. So you do, after a period of years, it might be 3 or 5 years, you have the ability to review that rent to market. Now, that can go up and down, but sometimes I find that if you have, I have had friends that have said, I've got 5% increases in my leases, and then they get to the market review and they've actually got to reduce the rent because it's sort of outstripped inflation, and it's not, it's just not fair. So the tenant can logically argue that the rent be reduced a little bit. But of course, the landlord has had the benefit of the high cash flow for the last 3 or 4 years. So everyone's sort of balancing out. It's just a bit of a reset one way or the other.
And there's got to be fairness that comes into that. I know we've always looked at those fixed annual increases that do work quite well. And if you are fair and reasonable about what they are, it works. And you don't generally get that argument from any tenant as to say, I shouldn't have to have a rental increase. This is now down to business and preference to the emotional attachment to the sort of property that we're getting into. So those things start to make sense. So that 3 to 4 annual increase at the moment is quite fair and reasonable. I agree with you. CPI at the moment is challenging. And yet over the last few years, CPI would have been a very minimal increase for tenancy. So you're right. It balances out eventually. It gets to that point where we
Yeah.
say, okay, where are we at? Where are the comparables? What's fair and reasonable in the market again? And we go again. So you do build a working relationship with your tenants over a period of time, which again is why we want to look after them, because they are our asset value, actually, more so than what just the bricks and mortar actually are.
Yeah, I mean, we're always doing things. We sort of model the big centres a bit. They always have their promotions arm, and they're doing things. Well, they're basically spending the tenants' money actually in those centres, but because the tenants are actually paying for those promotions, it's in their lease. They've got to pay a certain amount. But our tenants, we don't charge them for promotion, but we might spend some money on social media, or put up some new flag signs, or new signage at the shops. But the best thing that we think that we do as landlords is keep the centres looking great. That's the most important thing, because I've seen so many centres. It'll be a landlord that's had it for 20 years, and it's just gone down and down and down, and there's pigeon crap everywhere, and the car park lines are all blurred, and those sort of things are just so obvious and actually don't cost a lot of money. So we're right onto that. We're a bit squeaky clean like that. So, and the tenants,
good because
yeah.
Of course they do, because it looks good for them. It looks good for their business. They appreciate being looked after. And for anyone else coming in, you drive around anywhere and you'll notice when things look and feel good. You go, wow, the sides of the roads are all mowed nicely. This is really great. So the same when you go into a shopping centre like that, people will notice that it looks good, it feels good, and they're more likely to drive in. Those other ones that have got no lines left in the car parking and pigeon poo everywhere, they're the ones we look to buy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Someone had enough. There's no attention to it. There's no drive to actually make this a good asset again. So they're the ones that are worth having a conversation around and being able to look at something from an off-market perspective.
Yeah, well, I'm right in the middle of a refurb now on one that was a bit tired, and okay. The amount of pigeons around properties, it's mind-boggling, and it's funny actually how tenants often don't complain. They don't want to complain. So, there'll be sort of crap running down the walls and no one says anything, so anyway, good thing to tidy up.
It is. It's sad to think though, because I think after, I guess they get into that, I don't want to ask when my rent will go up, I don't want to ask. So a lot of it will come down to how that's been managed over a long period of time, or I'm sick of asking so nothing ever happens. Where again, if you're looking after tenants, they feel good. They're very okay to say, hey, thanks, that's exciting. This is what's happening. They'll make recommendations. If you have a vacancy, it's a whole lot easier to fill it when you've got great tenants in there that talk well of their treatment, their leases, and certainly the environment you've created. So again, a lot comes off the back of having and maintaining a good asset for your tenants. And I do like the way that you actually incorporate that into it, so it's not an added cost for them.
Yeah.
Because that becomes one of the biggest challenges, is it's the add-ons from a tenancy perspective that they'll give consideration to.
One thing I learned from residential, Melissa, with, that sort of flowed into my commercial, is that when I was renovating houses, I remember a valuer coming round to, value the property. I was halfway through the renovation and he said, you're in that crucial point where, you can't really get a good sale on this property because you're not finished. So you need the money to finish it to make it look good. And he said, it's always better to have properties that look good, and it's obvious, of course, so don't run around having a whole heap of half finished projects, so it's better to get them finished, get them and keep them looking good. Simple.
And so one thing I like about commercial property is when we talk about renovations, and because a lot of people out there do renovations, and I think a lot of people start with a renovator. So they'll buy it, they'll renovate it, or sell it, and they go, yay, this is great. And some people will do that forever and a day. They make businesses out of it. Other people will do it and go, yeah, that was great. I made some money out of it, but that was too much like hard work. I don't have the time for it and all of these things. But when we look at commercial property and renovations, it's a little bit different, isn't it? We're not out there spending the same amount of money, time, effort on creating the internal fit out, the extent of a renovation as you would with residential. But there are some very important key factors externally when we're presenting a commercial property. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. And what we've found is even getting and of course in some leases, the first thing is in a lot of leases, what one of our childcare centres, every 5 years they have to repaint, in and out. So that's often built into the lease. So it's just a matter of reminding them that they've got to repaint, and then they submit the colours to you and off you go. But with the other 14 shops, and that's, we've got a childcare and 14 shops, I was very surprised how inexpensive it was compared to residential to get a shopping centre painted. It's sort of, I know, getting a house painted in Byron Bay at the moment, you can spend $40,000 just getting a house painted in and out. It's crazy. But we get the whole exterior of our 14 shops painted for about 25 grand. I mean, okay, they're spray painting it, but we plan to do it, every 5 years, and it's a tilt bill construction. It's it's an easy surface to paint on. And even the guy said to me, he said, these are easy jobs. We go around on the weekend and there's nothing like a coat of paint to make something look great.
Absolutely. So there's a definite learning for people, and that mindset change too, going from residential over to commercial, and the difference in a dollar spent and the effect that it actually has. Because like you've just said, there's nothing better than a coat of paint, right?
Yeah.
To freshen something up and make it look good. You look at the basic things like signage, access, not too many trees to block everything from a commercial perspective. You're looking at their business and how their business is presented now from the street, and preference to the fancy things on the inside that cost a lot of money residentially. I know we often joke about the renovation of a commercial property is a pressure washer, a broom, and a spray gun. That's pretty much what's required, right? And there's a lot of truth in it, though. There's no point in overcapitalizing.
No, that's right. And I mean, look, as long as if you do have a vacant tenancy, I mean, that shopping centre we bought, Sandstone Lakes, we only had 4 tenants out of 14 when we bought it. So, if you do have a vacancy, have the windows clean, paint it white inside, make sure the lights work, all that, because, you can always offer incentives if you get the right tenant for a fit out, but you certainly don't need to start, you can't really start fitting out vacant shops. I mean, until you get a tenant. So,
pointless.
It's basically just keeping it like a nice, clean, available space is the thing to do.
And I think once you've overcapitalized, it takes away your ability to offer things to a tenant from an incentive perspective. You've already spent your money on things that weren't necessary. Yeah. You're better off saving that and being able to offer some incentives to get them in, because tenants are always looking for that shift from one place to another, or starting up a business, whatever the case may be. What can some of those incentives be that help them out, that start building that good relationship with them and get them started in a space that's conducive for them? So with all the experience that you've had and all of the people that you have actually taken through your course and mentored and all of these things, that have to be some standouts over the years for you, both on the, wow, that was an amazing outcome, and on the, wow, that was a challenge that we we had to navigate around. Have you got a couple of examples you'd be happy to share?
Well, one of them, of course, is your deal. The deal that you did on the shops, that was fantastic. But, we probably don't need to talk about that. But just people in the course, that one of them stands out. Actually, I've got some notes here. Young Brett, who bought a shopping centre up in Bowen in Queensland, and he was a residential investor and found a shopping centre. I think it had 8 tenants, and it was 1.25 million for the 8 shops, which I think, I remember people chattering in my Facebook group, on the private Facebook group. They were saying, wow, that's just incredible. That's the price of an apartment in Sydney, and that was such a great deal for this guy. It was life-changing, because I think with his numbers on that, let's say he put about $400,000 into that he was able to get from his residential properties, and the net rent on that one when he bought it, and this is going back a couple of years, was 140,000 net. That's after outgoings, so that all the outgoings were paid, and all he had to pay from that 140 was his mortgage costs. And I just worked out this morning, even now, if he had $900,000 mortgage at 5%, given the rate increases, he'd be 95,000 a year cash flow positive on that. But it sort of didn't stop there, because he had a bit of available space in the car park, which he perhaps could have put something else in, and also could have strated all those shops into 8 separate things and sold, 8 separate properties, and then sold those off. So it was just a fantastic deal. And that, having that 95,000, you can imagine someone writing you a check every year for $95,000 and saying, okay, now I want to go and buy another one. And, I'm actually not sure if he's bought anymore. And sometimes I say to people, you probably only need to do one deal. Maybe you just do one deal. I mean, if he pays that off, he's getting all the rent, so that was a great deal.
It's interesting. I remember those words when I first actually met with you. Everything can change with just one deal. And potentially that's all you actually need to do. I've got to say, it gets a bit addictive though. There's no two ways about it.
Well, knowing where to stop, and and I've got another actually little case study, which is a cheaper property, which actually a good friend of mine bought. And this, I don't know if we could talk about it now, but it's an interesting one because he's bought it at the low, and everyone asks me this question, Melissa. He's bought it with the low interest rates. So he's bought this property at 527 grand. It's an office in a nice building in Maroochydore, and been fully leased right through all the lockdown. So he's had a good run. So he paid, 527,000, and he put 150K he had sitting around in his own from a sale of a property in Sweden. This is Frederick's property. So he brought that 150K out here, and he got a loan. ANZ were offering these loans at 2.9%. So he got that. So his net income was 40,000 a year, and his repayments are only 12. So he's 28,000 a year cash flow positive, and rolling on. It's been 2 years. He's been banking that money. Everything's been great, but now his loan's going to go up to around 5%, which is classic because everyone's saying to me, "Oh God, it's all disaster. It's now 5%," but of course his rent is now going up 7%. With the latest CPI. So he's still actually got, at the end of the day, with his rent going up, he's still actually cash flow positive, nearly 23,000 a year from that deal. And if you apply, now let's say you put 150,000 into the bank at the moment, I think you can get maybe you can get 4%, for 6 months or something. I don't know, if you looked around, but he's getting $22,000 return on his 150,000 that he invested.
You can't argue with that.
I told him that the other day, and he got the calculator, and he said, "Oh my God, you're right." He said, "The cash on cash return is unreal." So, and he was a guy that really didn't know anything about commercial property, and just said, "Look, I want to buy for cash flow." And so that was a great thing. We helped him get into that deal and checked it out a little bit for him. So it was just, it was great for that, someone who had that sort of challenge that just didn't want to be anything that was going to be stressful or too risky, so it's been great.
And there's a lot said for that though, because, we talk about you will lean into various different asset classes and definitely locations as well. Some people are very metro orientated, others are very comfortable going out regional and all of this, but it's an individual thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, the thing that's happened with the lockdowns, just like the lockdowns caused this crazy boom in Byron. It's not that if you get a residential boom in a regional area, it doesn't immediately follow on. This is actually probably a big tip for people looking at the moment. It doesn't immediately follow on that all commercial properties are suddenly going to jump up in value, because it's a bit of a slower process. It's sort of the commercial, naturally, if you go to a regional area and all the residential properties have increased and more people have moved there, slowly but surely, any vacancies would get filled in the commercial properties, and there'll be more interest in those commercial properties. So, the rents might go up, and therefore the values will go up. But it's a slower process, so it's quite a good time to be looking regionally for commercial property.
Absolutely. There's a big drive for regional too, I think, off the back of people heading out of metro and some of the lockdowns and challenges and all the rest of it. But as well as that lifestyle now, because they're not in the office all the time, or they're not in that workplace all the time. They can work from home. They can mix and match what they do and work it in their favor, that people are looking for lifestyle more so. So it's increased that influx into regional areas, which in turn has now said, hey, we need more businesses in here. So there's a little bit better demand for it. which is being supported quite well. So of course, with that, you're going to see the value sitting quite nicely. The risk is going to be lower, which is always nice to see. Funnily enough, I listen to some of the deals that your students are doing, and we say that starting position where people may be at a lower risk, and what asset class do they lean into? Again, it's what you're comfortable with. It says generally what you know to start off with versus, oh my gosh, I have to go and find an industrial property that I know nothing about, or I have to go into a shopping center to make passive income. It's not the case, is it? Pretty much any commercial asset class done well, you can make passive income.
Yeah, I think, I always talk about little busy hubs, and it's like Maroochydore, that's going back to that deal. That tenant is someone who operates in the worldwide digital space. I'm not quite sure what they do, but Frederick has a similar business. So, he had this affinity with these guys. So, he was Googling around saying, look, these guys are a worldwide company. They're based in Maroochydore because apparently it's got the fastest internet in Australia. It actually has the main cable coming from Asia, apparently. I'm not quite sure if that's correct, but, that's what we were told. And when, I always recommend people go to check out the properties physically, of course. And Frederick bought this during lockdowns, but was able to get there. But, it was flat out busy. Everywhere was right back from the Sunshine Plaza, and there was people everywhere, even during the lockdowns. So there's all these busy little hubs, so it might be an office block, but it's a busy little hub, all good mix of tenants, that sort of thing. So each deal is individual.
So when you're looking at increasing now, aside from just being able to annually increase our rents, because if you get your lease sorted well, that's going to be one of the triggers that are in there, that every year the rent is going to go up X amount of percent, or the CPI, and that's a big tick. What are some of the other things that you suggest to people to actually look to be able to do to increase their rent from day one to get to those percentage returns that they'd like to achieve off a property?
I've had one of my little niches was buying properties that had, say, a shop downstairs, a classic sort of terrace house property, shop downstairs and an old flat above, and sometimes, some land at the back. So that's always been a good one. That you could perhaps turn the apartment upstairs. Well, it's finished being a flat, now it's an apartment, and that could be a luxury Airbnb. And I've had some people in the course that have done that very successfully. Buying a building with shops at the bottom, old apartments above, thinking originally to convert them to offices, but then went the Airbnb route and had really great cash flow. And also looking for properties that have more land. So, you perhaps could put a container coffee shop if it's a small shopping center, or you might be able to build more at the back. A couple of students have been very successful in the signage space, as you know. I know that you've done that yourself with the digital signage, and in fact, only look for properties that are on main roads. And then they do their magic with the signage, going to the outdoor advertising companies, or do it yourself, as I know that you've done, and have made really good money from that. I mean, a sign is basically another tenant that you've just created without doing anything really, except putting your finger on the pulse of it all. So those sort of things. I mean, I've had people that have leased out car parks at the back. They've formalized a car park, they put a boom gate in, and realised that, the tenants were only parking 2 cars in a spot that could take 8. And there was people up the street that would say, oh, if I can lease a secure spot, $100 a month or $200 a month, whatever it is, every dollar that comes in, capitalizes out into extra cash flow and therefore extra value. So trying to think of some other ones, there's a million of them. but
it's interesting, because this is what people have got to start looking at. What else can I do here? What else can I do that improves what we're offering, and definitely brings in another income, because it actually adds that value to your overall asset. And for those things like signage will add value back to tenancies. It's generally something that is considered, that circular thing where the tenant gains, you gain, the new tenancy coming in, or the people in the signage, everyone gains something out of it. but it's what else? We can walk away from a commercial property way too soon before we've actually maximized its potential.
I remember one deal that was in a country town, and it was that classic shop that was a huge shop, some sort of clothing store, and they really only needed about half the space, a big wide frontage. And, that was able to be divided up, and they were both happy because the guy kept his clothing store with less rent, but the overall rent increase was, of course, way more. So, then you're able to rent another space out to someone else. So there's so many things that I see people actually do walk away from, leaving dollars on the table. They say, oh, that's not a deal, or that's untidy, or another one, Melissa, is going to look at a property where the person's lease is about to finish, and let's say it's a hairdresser that's been in there 10 years, but they've only got, say, 6 months to go on their lease, and they go, oh no, I don't want that, because they've only got 6 months to go. Well, talk to them, see if they'd sign up.
If they've been there 10 years, they're not likely to walk away from their custom now. So go and have a chat with them. Isn't it interesting? So personally, for me, so risk factor is not the issue. I like vacancy because I know what a lease value is, and also know that we can create a great dynamic within tenants if you're prepared to take something on with a few vacancies and know that area will support the outcome. How do you feel about people going into something that's got vacancy on it?
I think it's sort of horses for courses, and if you've got enough backing to buy it, and it's really, I reckon, if someone spends a couple of days in a location looking around and talking to people, they'll really get their finger on the pulse quite quickly as to what a vacant space would rent for. And it's and I go through that in the course a lot about working the numbers backwards, because an agent might say to you, oh, look, this is a shop that can get $600 a week, for example. But then when you look around for a couple of days, you find that every other shop in the street's $400 a week. Okay, redo your numbers, redo your numbers at $400 a week, plus maybe allowing $20,000 to tart that place up. So it's just, and then going in with an offer. Now, had this happened in Ballina recently, we were looking at a little hair salon, another hair salon, and the owner wanted, I think, $600,000. We thought there was no way it was worth more than about $375 on the current rent. And, the agent just about fell over and fainted when we suggested that. And we went off and did something else. And months later, the agent rings me and said, well, yes, it did sell for that.
Oh.
Which I hate. And I knew that would happen. I said to Anthony when we were looking at it, I said, oh, hang on, you watch this. As soon as we make an offer, which was almost about half what they were asking, because we just worked the numbers backwards. We said, well, hang on a minute, you're saying this, but it's not actually, it's based on the numbers, all the emotion taken out of it, came back and then, blow me down. 2 months later, the guy said, oh, yes, he ended up selling it for basically what you said. So anyway.
It's crazy. That is crazy. It's true, though. You've got to be able to do those numbers. Commercial property is all about the numbers. Absolutely. I always suggest to people, if they can get their hands on a valuation, they're great to read through and see how a valuer actually creates what that end value is. And sometimes we like it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we'll see things from a different perspective to some valuers, but to read through those valuations is gold, because you'll see the facts that they pull together and the numbers that they pull together to substantiate what an overall valuation is. So a couple of things it allows you to do is then say, well, what does my lease need to look like for me to get a good valuation in preference to what I've got? And then definitely, what is this worth as it sits now? Because often you will see things on the market where they're trying to sell potential, right? Where they're working out a value based on it being fully tenanted. In fact, you've got 3 vacancies. So understanding it at that level allows you to put an offer forward that potentially is half what they're asking for, but it's substantiated. It's an actual real, a more realistic value than what the vendor's actually expecting. Do you get to get in front of the vendor often?
Oh, not often. We had a little bit of a touch with the vendor, let's say when we were buying Sandstone Lakes Plaza. Well, it was called something else then, but it was, almost talking to the guy because we made such a low offer that he got annoyed, of course. But same thing, we were basing that, there was 3 tenants and we were just basing our offer on the rent from the 3 tenants because I thought, wow, this is going to take a long time to sort out. So if I can get it for that, fine. And I think a lot of people forget that when they're looking at deals. I spoke to someone the other day that was going to talk to the vendor at a property out at UKI, and same thing. We thought it was worth about half what they were asking. And I said, oh, wow, you're going to have to be careful here you don't offend them. So sometimes I try to avoid it. I'd rather go through the agent. But the problem is with that, when you're making, perhaps a very low offer, a lot of the agents are so embarrassed to put it to it because they've told the guy in the first place the price.
Yes.
They said, this is worth 600 grand, when in reality, the offers are coming in well below that, and then they've got egg on their face. I mean, a good agent will just submit any offer, but, sometimes it's tricky, with those things. So I do urge people to work the numbers backwards and really demand that offers are getting submitted, And
we always say too, so I mean, the legalities around it, if you put it in writing, they're supposed to put it in front of the vendor, are relevant. But I agree too, being able to substantiate how you've come up with that offer takes the emotion out of it. Certainly, whatever the agent has said to the vendor is certainly no longer relevant. These are the numbers. It is what it is, right? Well, and now,
I mean, you're working on a cap rate. Let's say if you went to Ballina today to buy a shop, the cap rate is about 5%. So meaning, for anyone listening, meaning that what an investor is expecting to get as a return if they invest 300 grand, they're expecting to get what's that? 15,000 a year rent. That's what they're expecting. So it just works backwards to work out the value.
And that cap rate is based on risk in the area and demand and on specific asset classes too. So if you were to look at industrial versus, say, office space, it's potentially quite a different cap rate based on areas, isn't it? So
that's right. And that's exactly right. I mean, in Byron, that's probably why I don't have any industrial in Byron at the moment, because some of the cap rates are around 4%. And, me as an investor, if I would rather buy something somewhere else that's 8%, because I know that I'm going to pay about 5% for my money, so at the moment, so that's how I work. Whereas, someone who wants to put all cash into a deal, that's another scenario. Of course, they're perhaps happy to buy something for 4% if they're putting more cash in or all cash. So it's, horses for courses.
And I think it's, you look at the long-term gains out of it as well. Can I do something else to increase that from 4% to maybe a 7 or 8% in that area? What are those uplifts? Maybe there's signage I can put there. Maybe there's that coffee van or whatever it is we can put in the front. What else do I need to do to increase that return? Or am I buying an end of the line product? What do you feel about end of the line products, James?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Well, let's say even that property that Frederick bought in Maroochydore, that's basically an end of the line product. And one thing I sort of forgot to say about that one, when he got the valuation and checked the market rent, it was bang on. The valuer said, yes, this is the perfect rent for this property, which is very important. It wasn't too high or too low. I mean, if it was a little bit low, that's great, because that's a little bit of an uplift you can get. But if it's too high, of course, you're paying too much for the property. So that's super important. So I think if you're buying, just a sort of done deal property and you just want to get, 6% net return, it's obviously very important that, you have a valuation and that everything stacks up, that the rental amount is correct for the market. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just depending what, let's say you're a busy doctor or someone like that who's got high income. They might just say, look, I'm just going to put $500,000 into this investment. I'm happy to get 6% return. It's on a 10-year lease. Forget about it. Classic examples like a Kentucky Fried Chicken store. You'd probably never go near it. Forget about it, just collect the rent. Perfect. Whereas people like you and I, we're looking for little angles to, buy something and increase it a little bit, and to get it above the market, because you're manufacturing your own growth and equity. So it's just a different style of investing, I guess.
And I guess it's based on time and desire to actually do it. For some people, they just want to find that end of the line product that is secure. They don't have to go near, that puts in an amount of money in their bank that they're very comfortable with. There's nothing wrong with that. If that suits their desires and needs at the time, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's just making sure, like you've said, that they've done the research around the buy-in price the rental returns that they're getting, and that's backed with some good facts to ensure they're going to the right. Which you give them all of that though.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. And I mean, there's levels of activity. Like someone like me, you know, we're quite, and you, I know you are as well. You know, we're very active investors. But just in even harking back to Frederick's deal, when we went to the building, you know, it's a strata title property. We said, oh, this is grubby, that's grubby, you know, it needs this. And we found out that it had nearly $100,000 in the sinking fund. So I said to Frederick, okay, you don't have to do much work here. You're just going to send a couple of emails, you know, just hassle that, get things painted, get this done, get that done. And suddenly it all got done, you know. So, and even on that strata property, he did find there was an uplift. There was the ability to put solar panels on the roof, you know, reducing the common air conditioning bill and all that type of stuff, which is money back in his pocket, more cash flow. Whereas, you know, people like us, I'm always hassling my managers, you know, we're on the phone to or emails, not hassling, but we're saying, oh, what can we do here? You know, what can we do there? Have you done this? Have you done that? You know, so that sort of thing is, I guess it's just various levels of how much time you've got and how active and perhaps aggressively investing you want to be.
I think that people grow with that too after they've done one, maybe two. People will grow with that. They'll either stick with what they're doing or they'll start venturing out and getting a little bit more involved in different asset classes or what they can add on. And so it is an individual thing. It's very, very true. It's a very individual thing. So question for you, with all the people you've worked with, and I know there's been a lot of them, what is one of the most common things that you see as far as a trip up? If someone was doing this on their own, that mistake that they would make that would see them either not stepping forward into a commercial property or doing something that was detrimental to their outcome. What is the most common one?
Oh, the biggest thing, there's a couple of them. One of them is getting stuck, and probably not in any order of importance, but one of them I see a fair bit, and even recently, is people getting stuck on a particular deal, and say one industrial shed or one shop or office, and they're going, I've got to get this deal, I want to get this deal, and they've gone down the path, even to the point of, let's say, spending a little bit of money on legal fees. You know, they've got someone to look at the contract and everything. And, you know, and they've gone down that path so far that they think, I have to complete this deal. And quite often I'll say, no, hang on a minute, this is looking bad, you know. And sometimes the other problem, which sort of leads on from that, is they haven't got a valuation early enough because they either didn't want to spend the money on the valuation or something's happened, you know, and the valuations come in, you know, maybe 10 or 15% lower than the price they've negotiated. And two things can happen from that. I mean, I would normally go back and say, well, let's renegotiate if you still want the property, because let's face it, Mr. Vendor, you're probably not going to sell it to anyone else because the same thing's going to happen again. And that often works. Or, you know, they just sort of, initially when they're looking at a deal, is not doing the numbers correctly. So the agent's saying it's worth 600K, for example, and, you know, if I did the numbers quickly, I might think, gee, this is really only about 520K, you know, and so they're off on the wrong foot to start with. Whereas, you know, I find that people lose momentum that way, and that's a big problem. You know, you really want to work out if a deal's a good deal or it's a dud pretty quickly, so you can move on from it or do the deal, you know. And sometimes I've seen people spend 3 months on a property deal, and then they just go, oh, bugger it, I'll just go back and buy a residential property, you know.
It's interesting that you say that, because yes, there's a lot said for getting some assistance around those things, because people don't know what they don't know. So stepping into commercial property, if you don't know how to do those numbers, you don't know how to do them. Okay, so very quickly you're going to come unstuck with paying over the odds for something, especially at the moment where we're looking at some of the prices on commercial properties. There's a lot of potential being built into it. And agents aren't going to tell you what the actual value is. So if they don't know, very easy to overpay for it. And definitely agree with that time spent on it. All of a sudden they're emotionally invested instead of being strategic around what they're actually doing. And I know based on doing your work, which, like I said, was an actual game changer for me, that you make sure that they understand this and they're on point with the basics first and how to very quickly do those basic numbers to say, is this worth spending more time on, or is there not? Which I think is so important to understand those 6 numbers first to say, does this even warrant looking at it further or not?
Yeah.
Because the more time you've spent on it, the more likely, especially people starting off, become emotionally involved, emotionally attached to this.
Yeah.
That they're not going to have it. I just have to.
I think it's interesting too that even with the agents, I'd say to some people, it can take like 10 emails to get the information. I mean, obviously the ideal commercial property to look at is someone gives you a proper information memorandum with everything on it. And within 10 minutes, you could say, yes, I could pay this for the property. And that's great. But a lot of the time, agents, it's like getting blood from a stone. So I just need, tell me this, tell me that, and it takes a while. But there's a point to that where that can be a benefit, because that could be a property that 20 people have inquired about and haven't been able to get the information from Joe Bloggs, the agent, and they've just left it alone. Whereas you and I might persevere and say, come on, we really need that information, and we might be the ones that get a great deal, because you really want to put yourself in a position where you can say to the agent, look, okay, that deal does look like it's worth that sort of money, or, obviously you're going to try something lower, or just say, look, that's a joke. We think it's worth this. Is there any hope for us on this deal or not? Let's walk away, so you can quickly move on. And that's the key to it all, because the more deals you look at, the better you're going to get at it.
Oh, absolutely. And the reality is, starting off, I think people should be going and saying, let's just do those numbers. Let's look at it and see what I can find irrelevant to whether it actually is something that they'd go into, because being able to look at things for what they're worth without the emotional attachment and being able to say no, I think makes for a better investor in the long run. When we have to, when we get to a point where you have to have it, it becomes quite challenging. How many times do you see, and sorry, just back to your point of we would persevere, when I see an agent that is dragging their feet, that drip feeds you, that can't give you the facts straight off, it's instantly, oh yeah, I'll buy through you, because they're generally not on top of things, and they generally are lazy, and most people won't stick at it. So you're not up against everybody else. Okay, so a good tip for everyone there, versus the very good commercial agents that say, here's the IM, it's all there for you, all the details. I'll give you 24 hours to go over it. I'll be on the phone chasing you, right? Those guys are doing the same to everyone else that's looking too. So now you're under a bit more pressure to start making decisions, and they will generally get the higher prices. Whereas that agent that's a little lazier, that doesn't deliver, they're not pulling the higher prices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing. I've pointed out, I remember I was dealing with an agent years ago that was, God, it was painful, to get the info out. But, I got a couple of good deals from him eventually. But there's another point there actually too, when someone does present a property really correctly on an information memorandum, and I had a friend buy a big medical centre, and all the outgoings and everything was set out very neatly in that document. So all our decisions were based on that. And I can't remember exactly what the numbers were. Let's say she bought it at 7% net return based on those numbers. Well, during the due diligence period that you get with commercial, you can basically hold that property for at least 21 days or 30 days, maybe longer. During that period, the owner announced that he'd made a mistake with the numbers. And, it made a difference in the purchase value of about $100,000 when you deducted the extra outgoings that he'd missed out. And he was very honest, but he said, oh, let's just reduce the price by 20 grand. But I said, oh no, it makes a difference of 100 grand. And my friend who was buying, she said, how does that work? And I said, because you were buying it based on a 7% return. Now the numbers are different. We reworked the numbers. The owner agreed and took 100,000 off that deal. So it's, it's just numbers. Everything's numbers. No emotion. No one has to argue, Great.
That demonstrates so clearly the power of those numbers, and that this is what commercial property is about. It's about the numbers. So for anyone that's not, a mathematician, don't stress over it. There are very easy calculations to do.
Yes.
And again, James, I know this is something that you teach explicitly, is how to understand those numbers and the sequence to run through them, because that's all it is. There's nothing else attached to it but those numbers. And that example very, very clearly demonstrates that. Going back to our little friends, the agents, often we will see residential agents trying to sell a commercial property because they've managed properties for a particular vendor and they've had a lot of residential stuff, but they had these couple of commercial properties forever and they've got no idea, how to present it, how to sell it, how the numbers work. How do you deal with that?
Oh, that is, it's just sometimes ridiculous. They will apply their residential sales method to, say selling a shop in Ballina or something, and they'll say, oh, it's a really nice looking shop, and you say, mate, I'm not caring about nice, I just want to show me the lease, and sometimes, they say, oh, well, I don't know, what are you talking about outgoings? What do you mean? It's just incredible, what goes on. But same thing, you can really have to sometimes educate them and say, look, these are the numbers I need. Give me some comparison rents, and often in that situation, if I'm dealing with a residential agent and it's an area that I don't really know well, which is often the case, I'll try and ring a local valuer and say, can you tell me what the cap rates have been for the last, 3 to 6 months and what the rents are in Johnson Street or whatever it is. And then you can go back to the agent and say, mate, this is why you're wrong. If he is wrong, sometimes, of course, it goes the other way. They've completely mispriced the property too cheaply. And, obviously you're not going to say anything about that. It's just, you go and do the deal,
Yeah. You've got to be patient, don't you? It's not like the residential game where it's, these are the comparables done, we're in, and we've got to get into that now. You've got to be a bit more patient, especially in those circumstances where you're dealing with agents that aren't commercial agents and don't understand it, to be able to educate them somewhat around the process and how it works from a numbers perspective.
Yeah, because if they're selling a normal residential property, you sign the contract, exchange and settle in 4 weeks. Well, with commercial, of course, it's completely different. You agree to the price and terms, but then you go into that due diligence period where you can renegotiate. It's sort of a bit like buying a yacht. You put it up on the slip, suddenly there's something wrong with it. You say to the guy, I'm not going to buy it unless you take that off, as simple as that.
Well, it's funny you actually relate it back to that. It is kind of like a little bit of a test drive, isn't it?
Yeah.
So can you just explain due diligence? Was there anyone that listening that is in the residential realm or not well versed in commercial are going to go, what is a due diligence period? What does it mean to me? And how do I get this? So can you just explain that a little bit?
So when you're initially negotiating a deal, so let's say you agree to buy something, for $600K and, you've paid a deposit, might be $10,000. You get your lawyer, or suggest, obviously you've got to use a lawyer, but, your lawyer would suggest that, we have a 30-day due diligence period. Sometimes it can be longer, sometimes shorter. They often can be extended. And during that time, your lawyer is going to go hammer and tongs doing a lot of searches and a lot of, getting information on that property that you perhaps haven't already got. So, it's similar to, residential, we're making sure there's not a highway going to go through it or power lines or something. But not only that, he's checking the lease out. You can be checking the tenant out, you be checking their financials, obviously getting a building inspection, those sort of things. So all through that 30 days, you've got quite a bit of stuff to do. But if you find things that are wrong, often, actually, I remember Jackie and Joe bought a building in Wagga, and the owner ended up giving them about $60,000 for repairs. He wasn't even aware that it needed repairing. So it's, that sort of thing. They sort of said, well, we can't go ahead with the deal because of these issues. And he said, okay, he's so far down the track with these people. He just thinks all I've got to do is reduce the price a bit and then I'll get the deal done. So due diligence is extremely important, and you never want to be frightened about pulling out of a deal during due diligence, which I have done several times. And it can cost you a little bit of money just in the legal fees and stuff, but it's sometimes way better to pull out and move on to another one than to stick with something that's a dud.
Absolutely. That due diligence period is very, very important. And I like the way you've touched on that, not just for the information that you need to get in an understanding around a property. And it's definitely very important for that. It allows you to reassess it while it's no longer on the market. So it takes the pressure away from those decisions that have to be made instantly, which agents can be very good at pushing for at times as well. So it gives you that opportunity to be able to assess things, and your lawyers and accountants and everyone else being able to assess things without that pressure behind you. But also the vendor gets invested in a sale. So
Absolutely.
the deeper into due diligence it gets, the more invested they are in this has sold.
Oh, that's it. I find, I mean, you've got this time when you're controlling that property. It's, it's totally up to you whether you can, whether you can buy it or not, basically. And, the vendor is sitting back thinking, oh, well, I've sold this property. He hasn't really heard anything from you, to week through due diligence. And then suddenly you hit them, your lawyer hits them with something saying, well, for example, one property we were buying, the original owner still owed $473,000 to the council, and that fee stuck with that was a big shopping centre that stuck with that property. So if we had settled without finding that out, we would have had to pay an extra 400 grand on top of a $2.3 million purchase. So that was a deal breaker. So our lawyers went in hard and said to this guy, well, this has got to be paid immediately, or it's taken out. In fact, what it was taken out of the settlement funds, and we made sure it was paid. So, but the importance of due diligence. That's why sometimes some people say to me, oh, I'm using a conveyancer for my commercial purchase. And I think, look, there's nothing wrong with conveyancers, of course, but I think commercial is a bit more involved. You really need a commercial savvy lawyer to do those things for you.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And a very good point you make there, because there's nothing wrong with conveyancers and they do a great job residentially, but there is, especially if you're coming into this new, because you're not always going to know what questions to ask, what to look for. You need someone that seriously understands that. And I know that step by step you take everyone through this, and your course demonstrates that very clearly. It gives people a lot of that upfront information to work with, so they don't get caught in those situations. Really interesting when you start looking at, that starting position and the due diligence. And I'll say some states worse than others, but I'll definitely refer to New South Wales here. When you're looking at something residentially, you can put an offer in, and in a heartbeat, it's pulled out from under you and someone else has taken it, and your head hasn't even stopped spinning before you've realized that the property is no longer yours. This is a game changer though, isn't it? Because this is a totally different situation where once you've taken it off the market and you're in due diligence, no one else can actually pull that out from under you and take over that property.
Controlling that property, often, the period of due diligence can get extended because often the vendor or their lawyer hasn't provided information that you've asked for in a timely manner, so you're chasing something like a document about the grease trap approvals or renewals, and they can't find it. And it's often essential that you have these documents when you buy the property or when you settle, because you'll never get them. Once they've settled, they've gone. So sometimes I've pushed out due diligence to 3 months on a property, So, you've got control.
And the more complex it is, the longer the time frame that you actually need, the more unorganized the other side is with their paperwork, that more time. And again, because you're dealing with things on a business level, not an emotional level, and they generally get it. They understand that there's complexity around it, so we'll extend due diligence time frame. So 3 months. How invested is that vendor after 3 months of due diligence in that sale? So they're so likely to negotiate well with you to actually keep that momentum going and have the sale complete.
Oh, absolutely. And look, if there's building problems, like physical building problems, which are very often the case, you suddenly say, well, look, this roof is, completely rotten, and it's $60,000 to replace. And they see the quote. You could send them the quote and they go, oh my God, well, if I keep this building, I'm going to have to fix that roof. So I may as well give James 60 grand now, or 40 grand, or negotiate or something, and he can do it, And I've seen that time and time again where people have had a building for 30 years and they haven't done any of these repairs, and they've actually ended up having to pay for them at the end anyway.
Isn't that interesting, James? So we would have to say that some of the things that people must get used to doing if they're going to get into commercial property is communicating and being okay to say, hey, this is what it is. Here are the facts. Because if you don't put it forward and you're not prepared to speak to people, well, you're not going to get the results that you want, are you?
No, that's right. And it's all being honest and upfront. You know, you're not trying to pull the wool over their eyes. You're just saying, this is what it is. Here's my reports. You know, that's it.
That's just gold. Tell me about the market trends. We see it all the time residentially. You'll see the cycles that everyone talks about and the highs, the lows, the crashes, to all of these things. Do you see commercial property getting caught up in those same market trends?
Well, I guess I was talking to someone the other day, Melissa, this has been the fourth sort of thing where, you know, interest rates have gone up or something's sort of happened. So in my career since I was 18, I guess, you know, I'm 65 now. So it's been like the fourth sort of thing, interest rates going up, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is with commercial, you know, you get the interest rates are going up because of high inflation. So, you know, rents are going up because of that. So, you know, there's that sort of buffering there. But commercial moves slower. Like if residential property prices tank, it doesn't really happen with commercial. It might slow down over a period of time, but the reason being because they're driven by the leases. And, you know, you've got long leases, you know, and if someone's just in there on a 5-year lease and they're on the correct rent, meaning not too high for them, not too low for the landlord, and they've got a sustainable business, they're going to just sail on through that 5 years. I mean, let's face it, their whole life's business is in their, you know, their value of their business is for their whole life sort of thing. So they want to maintain it. So it's sort of this sort of buffering situation. So at the moment, I sort of see that cap rates on commercial property are going up slightly, meaning that, you know, people are expecting to get maybe 7 or 8% return on a regional property rather than buying something a year or so ago that was saying getting, you know, 6%, simply because they're going to pay a little bit more for their money. That's, you know, someone is borrowing, you know, obviously if you're not borrowing, it's different. So I, you know, think well-located properties are always going to be great. And that means it doesn't have to be, you know, a major city to have a well-located property. You could have a property in a tiny regional town, but you could be in the best little location in that tiny little town, rather than, you know, being somewhere that's maybe a back street or something. So, you know, every town, every market's really individual. But the other thing I see is the share market. You know, people have sort of had the wobbles with that. And I've got friends that are, you know, heavily invested in the share market. And then they go, oh, I've got to get out of this. I'm going to go back into property. I just want to collect rents, you know. So, yeah, it's interesting. But, you know, we've got a growing population and we need residential and commercial property. So, you know, any new residential area that goes up, always going to have a commercial component.
Do you see anything new in the commercial sector at the moment? So new trends that are happening, the new uses and specific asset classes, anything that's a standout that you're noticing over the last couple of years that is beneficial to anyone to know, to understand, to give consideration to?
Well, definitely. I mean, definitely there's been, you know, I've always been promoting regional areas, you know, to get sort of slightly higher returns, but, you know, there's can be slightly higher risk with that. But I think that risk factor has dropped now a fair bit because of the increase of interest in regional areas, as we discussed before, but also new style of properties like industrial properties that have got, you know, sort of automation and logistics and, you know, better facilities, things like that. People are going for that. And I know you've done some with, you know, the residential component above sort of thing, which are great. A lot of properties that have got energy efficient thing. I mean, electricity is so expensive. So, you know, for example, we often offer our tenants, you know, we'll say, look, we'll put solar panels on the roof just for you, you know, that sort of thing. So if you're looking at properties and you know, you've got 2 or 3 properties and one's got a roof full of solar panels, so that might be something you'd look at over the other properties. Another thing, future-proof buildings. So, buildings that are easily adjustable. So you might be looking at an old building that's 3 stories that hasn't got a lift, but can you put a lift in there somewhere? And there's all sorts of new styles of lifts, that you can put in quite easily these days, and actually not that expensive. I got a price the other day for a single story lift. It was 60 grand, fully installed, and I thought, wow, that seemed pretty good. Green buildings, different opportunities in the office space, which, I guess people are looking at that now as people are slowly coming back in the office markets. I'm not completely across the office markets myself, but, I've heard that's a big thing. They're still saying there's a big shortage of industrial. So that's probably something to look at. But one little warning with industrial is, if you're buying in an area that's got heaps of industrial land, obviously, it can be a bit like musical chairs. They shove up another new building. So fine if you've got a long lease, but if there's a whole heap of vacancies when your lease is coming due, someone might be able to offer those tenants a better deal. So, but if you're buying an existing location that's already full, that's probably my preference for industrial at the moment.
Yeah, there's an amount to give consideration to, especially when they're opening up larger industrial allotments. And that, like you said, there's an amount of opportunity there from a tenancy perspective. What will happen? There's an amount of effort that needs to be put into that. And again, I think locality to residential and CBD is always a nice little player as well to give consideration to. But you're right,
absolutely.
It's industrial at the moment is a big tick in a lot of areas because the variation in use. Like we spoke about earlier, it's not just the heavy industrial stuff anymore. They're allowing that lighter use and a more mixed use to go in. So there seems to be a greater demand and a greater need for it just based on price point, because industrial land is cheaper than commercial. So
yeah, absolutely. And the builds, they do the tilt build buildings. Really probably the cheapest building you could probably build in Australia today is probably a tilt build construction, I'd say.
It's effective, time effective.
Yeah.
So,
The other thing that I think is important, we've got automation and car charges. So if you've got a newer property that you're looking at that's full of sort of any sort of in-house automation thing, it could be anything from the air conditioning, or people have full security systems that are already built in when they come. So if you buy a property and the tenants have got this whiz-bang system of, the air conditioning that's more efficient and maybe underfloor heating and all those sort of things, that if you're looking at 2 buildings, I would probably go for the one that's got the whiz-bang gadgets, because that's probably what the tenants will prefer.
It's true that you say that. When we're looking at any, and I'll say any asset class here, it's important to not just look at it for yourself, but look at the cost of operating for a tenant. I can vouch for this with the hospitality industry. Operating some buildings is expensive. And if a tenant's coming in and they've got a solid lease and you've worked that out and it's fair for all, but their operating costs are so expensive that it just makes it unviable for them to do business, then we need to give consideration to that. So yes, if you've got an option of what one you're going to go for, I'd certainly be looking at good technology and efficiencies that are built in to minimize the operating costs for tenants, because they're going to love that and they will stick with you for a long time if it's cheaper and more efficient to operate from your building than from one, across the road or next door that doesn't have those things built in. So it's a very valid point to make. And there's a lot of cool stuff in this space at the moment. So, James, I'm super excited to actually have your course up on our Property Inc. platform. I'm very grateful because the difference you made in my life with your teachings, your knowledge and everything was incredible. So to see you still sharing that, I'm very, very grateful for. And I can't wait to see the further impact that it has over many, many people's lives. Now, what I've got to say to you guys listening to this is it is super cheap. It is insane to think that this is less than $5,000 to actually squeeze everything out of James's mind into a course that steps you from step 1 through to success in the commercial property realm. Like I said, it's changed how I look at commercial property from day one, and I know the things that James teaches. So, like I said, it's an insane price to pay. for what you can actually get out of this. So just give consideration if you were going to go in and you were going to pay a project manager, or you're going to pay someone to actually undertake the process of getting you in and out of a commercial property successfully. What would that cost you? Maybe for a really quick turnaround, maybe $20,000, even a buyer's agent, $15,000, $20,000, right through to the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a project manager to see it through from start to finish. And you can learn everything James knows for less than $5,000. That is absolutely crazy, isn't it? So, and James, question for you off the back of it then, just while we give consideration to that, what is the most costly thing that someone could do, or mistake that someone could make going into commercial property?
Absolutely is not getting educated about the numbers. It's numbers driven. And if you don't know the numbers, you're just completely in the wrong position to start with. So that's number one. But number two, and it sort of certainly happened to me in the early days, not having that sort of group to talk to and other people to bounce things off that didn't have, that weren't going to earn money from it, So basically, being able to talk to other people and run some questions that, past people, because when I started out, there's no internet, it was all like, oh, just pick up a phone and try and ring someone. Then you couldn't get onto them, and it was just to ask a simple question. And there's no dumb questions in anything. But when you're starting out, if you haven't got that basic knowledge, you can't even start to look at a deal. And that just completely puts people off. And then they generally just go back to what they're doing before. So they just can't get to their goal because they just haven't got the basics to start with. But moreover from that, once you get into a deal, there's always going to be little questions that, you perhaps haven't picked up through my course, haven't been able to get maybe to that point in the course. You can just ask the questions in the group and you'll get the answers and you'll be able to move forward with that deal or move on from that deal, whichever's better for you, So it's just super important. I can't stress enough about the numbers. One example was a lady he'd come into my course, but had bought something in Tasmania about 2 years before she entered the course. And as soon as she got into the course, she realized that she'd done the wrong thing, just didn't know what she was doing. She was told a price by an agent, bought a little shop and couldn't figure out why it wasn't cash flow positive when everything else in the area was, and it was just simply not knowing the numbers. So she really had to pivot out of that and do something else to get ahead again.
And we don't want people learning from those sort of mistakes when they've got an opportunity like this where they can have the support and the information behind them, get into it, be successful, and then keep going. James, I cannot thank you enough for your time. We all know how precious and valuable time is. And I know that the reason behind doing this for you was lifestyle. We were just chatting about being off surfing and things like this. So you've created an incredible lifestyle for yourself out of what you actually teach people. So just a final parting word to everyone out there on how this can impact their life, the difference it can actually make for them and the benefits off the back end.
Oh, look, I think being a good landlord is one of the best businesses in the world. I mean, I talk to a lot of people all over the place and they just say, look, it's not just collecting rent, it's really providing, income that's separate from whatever you can physically go out and have to work to get. That's one point. But just the interaction with people, through the process is a fantastic thing. And, certainly someone like myself who's sort of retired early, but then I thought, wow, this is a bit boring when you're not sort of doing anything. It's just a great business. It's a really great business. And if you do choose to be creative in property, and it's not saying that you have to be, you can just be a passive investor. But if you want to be a little bit creative, you can certainly make some fantastic gains in equity and cash flow. And, basically, be able to pat yourself on the back and say, listen, I've done this on my own. I've taken an educator risk as an investor, and now I'm reaping the rewards. And, as you know, with property, once you move on a few years, it's amazing how much you can see rents to grow. 1 minute you're earning maybe $10,000 a month, and roll on 10 years time, it could be $80,000, $100,000 a month coming in and rent, and it's just a total game changer.
It's a lifestyle producer, isn't it? We can create that time and lifestyle that you want.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm probably like you. I sort of off renovating all sorts of other things, basically paid for by the the rental income from the commercial stuff. So I'm sort of renovating the commercial properties to help me renovate my other little properties that I love. And right today, at the moment, we're putting a brand new pond in here on the property. So I've got the excavators down there. So it's all
very good. Well, when you love what you do, you don't call it work, do you? So it gives you the lifestyle that you want, and it allows you to go off and do what you want to do when you want to do it. It's life by choice, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. And there's a fantastic community of investors. That's one of the big things, especially with Property Inc. and the Facebook groups and all that. There's so many people that really love, property investing and are very happy to share their experiences. And, in our group, we've got people that have got 60 and $100 million worth of property. And we've got people that are starting out with, $400,000 or $500,000 properties. So it's just that whole gamut of people, and it's just a different number,
As an absolute credit to you as well. So yes, within the platforms, there are great communities of people that are prepared to share what they've learned, which says a lot, because out there in the big wide world, when you're not educated and you're not in amongst that, it's very easy to get caught up in the wrong advice or the wrong piece of information that's generally not by bad intention. It just happens. And if you don't know any different, that's the path that you head down, and it's not necessarily the correct path, or it's not necessarily going to serve you well. So to be in amongst these communities, especially when you've got experienced people like that in there, and people that have just learned themselves, they're happy to share information. They're happy to help guide you along that way if you're prepared to ask the questions.
That's it. And there's never a silly question. We get so many questions, and I love answering them. We're always involved in the groups and stuff. So it's great. Keeps me engaged, and I absolutely love it. Someone said I was a little bit like, they felt I was going to end up like Mick Jagger. I'd still be talking about it when I'm 80 or whatever he is. I probably will be.
I was going to say, I don't doubt that one little bit. I reckon you will be.
Probably.
And I look forward to the tips that you're giving in another 20 years, right? I'm sure they'll be every bit as valuable. Thank you so much for your time today, James. Now we're going to have, there'll be notes and links in below this for people to click onto, to get your course, to be able to sign up, to be able to get into the platform and start seeing what other people are talking about, and all of the details that they actually need for doing that. I've got to thank you so much for coming along and having a chat today and sharing everything that you do know. I actually look forward to seeing the amount of people that lean into this and start making some difference in their life and having some positive impact off the back of what they learn from you. It's always exciting to see. And I know that within the platform, we have a huge amount happening there. It is so good to see the interaction. It's so good to see what people are actually doing. Like you said, like-minded people are great to be around. There's a lot to learn and benefit from that. So thank you. I look forward to chatting again, because we will, no doubt about it. I look forward to seeing the next little shopping centre that you take on, and certainly what's happening within your group. So
Great.
Good luck with the pond.
Yeah, thanks. See, I'll go down on hat on and go and check that out in a minute. But thanks so much. It's been great to chat, and look forward to chatting soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And like I said, guys, thank you for listening. We'll put all the links and details that you need below, so you can click on the links, get all the information, and look forward to seeing you on the other side. Righto, James. Thank you very much.